The morning sun broke through the London fog like a blade through silk. Outside Buckingham Palace, the crowds pressed against the iron gates, cameras ready, voices hushed. They were waiting for the changing of the guard. But what they were about to witness would become the story they told for years. No one noticed her at first. A small figure in a navy blue coat, her hair tied back with a white ribbon. Princess Charlotte stood near the edge of the palace courtyard, her small hands clasped behind her back. She was watching, studying, her eyes fixed on the guards in their red tunics and bearskin hats. Standing motionless like statues carved from stone, the tourists whispered among themselves, snapping photos, pointing at the palace windows. Some hoped to catch a glimpse of royalty. They had no idea royalty was already standing 20 feet away, hidden in plain sight among the palace, staff's children who sometimes played in the secured areas during private family events. Charlotte was 7 years old enough to understand rules, old enough to know that royal children were supposed to be seen and not heard, polite, perfect, poised, but something stirred in her chest. That morning, something that felt like thunder before a storm. One of the guards stood directly in front of her, his face forward, eyes ahead, expression frozen. His name was James Coulter, 23 years old. He'd served in the Queen's Guard for 2 years. He knew the rules better than anyone. Don't move. Don't speak. Don't react. No matter what happens, you are a statue. You are stoned. Charlotte took 3 steps forward. Her small shoes made almost no sound on the gravel. She stopped directly in front of Guard Coulter, tilting her head upward to look at his face. He didn't move, didn't blink. She studied him like a puzzle she was determined to solve. Then she did something no one expected. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small wooden stick, no bigger than a ruler, painted silver, with a golden handle wrapped in ribbon. A toy sword. Her brother George had given it to her last Christmas. Though he'd long since forgotten about it, Charlotte held it up, pointing it directly at the guard's chest. Her voice rang out clear and sharp in the morning air. I challenge you to a duel. The tourists nearby froze. Phones lowered. Whispers stopped. Even the pigeons seemed to pause mid-flight. Someone gasped. A child giggled nervously, then went silent when their mother shushed them. Guard Coulter's eyes remained forward, his jaw tight. His hands gripped his rifle with steady precision. But inside, his heart was hammering against his ribs. Protocol was clear. Do not engage. Do not move. No matter who stands before you, you are invisible. You are air. But this wasn't just anyone. This was Princess Charlotte, third in line to the throne. A child who could, with a single word to her parents, change the course of his entire career. And she was challenging him to a duel. In front of 300 tourists, with cameras recording every single second, the moment stretched like taffy, thin and tense, ready to snap. The world held its breath. If you're loving this story so far, hit that subscribe button now, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Charlotte didn't lower her sword. She stood firm, her small chin raised, her eyes locked on the guard's face, waiting, expecting, demanding. The stick trembled slightly in her hand, but her voice didn't waver. I said, I challenge you. The guard's finger twitched. Just barely. Just enough that someone watching closely might have seen it. Behind them, a palisade noticed the scene unfolding. Her face went pale. She took 1 step forward, then stopped. Protocol said never to interfere with the guards. But protocol didn't account for this. The crowd began to murmur. Some smiled, charmed by the innocence of a child playing pretend. Others looked nervous, unsure if this was allowed. If someone should intervene, if this tiny princess was about to learn a harsh lesson about rules and duty, and then Guard Coulter did something that no one saw coming. His eyes shifted, just for a fraction of a second, down toward the little girl with the silver stick. It was the smallest movement, barely perceptible, but in the world of the Queen's Guard, it was everything. It was acknowledgement. It was breaking the sacred rule. The tourist gasped. A camera shutter clicked rapidly, capturing the moment frame by frame. The palisade's hand flew to her mouth. She knew what this meant. Guards had been disciplined for less. Reassigned, removed. The role demanded absolute perfection. And perfection meant being invisible even when a princess stood before you. But Charlotte didn't know any of that. She only knew that the tall man in the red coat had looked at her, had seen her, and that meant the game was on. Her face lit up with triumph. She raised her wooden sword higher, standing on her tiptoes. "You accept," she declared. Guard Coulter's mind raced. He'd been trained for protesters, for tourists who got too close, for weather that could freeze your bones or heat that made you faint inside the heavy uniform, but nothing in his training covered this. Nothing prepared him for a 7-year-old royal with a toy sword and the determination of a Viking warrior. His commanding officer was somewhere behind him, likely watching, likely seeing everything. Coulter could feel the weight of consequences building like storm clouds. But when he looked back at Charlotte's face, at the pure joy and expectation shining in her eyes, something in him softened. She wasn't trying to get him in trouble. She was just a child who wanted to play. The seconds ticked by like hours. The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Some people were smiling now, their phones recording, sensing they were witnessing something special. Others looked concerned, waiting for an adult to step in and end this strange standoff. Then Coulter made his choice. His hand moved slowly, deliberately. He shifted his rifle slightly to the side, creating space. Then, with movements so precise they seemed choreographed, he reached toward his belt. The crowd leaned in, confused. What was he doing? From a small holster meant for ceremonial purposes, he drew something small. A polishing cloth he used for his boots and rifle. But in his hands he folded it quickly, expertly, into a long, thin shape. He held it out like a blade. Like a sword, the crowd erupted. Not in disapproval, but in wonder. Someone started clapping. Then another. Then a dozen people, their applause rippling through the morning air like music. They understood now. This wasn't a breach of protocol. This was something more. This was kindness meeting duty. This was a guard who saw a child and chose humanity over rules. Charlotte's eyes went wide. Her mouth opened in surprise and delight. The guard was playing along. He was actually playing along. She adjusted her stance, holding her wooden sword properly now, the way she'd seen in movies. Her face grew serious, focused. If this was a duel, she would give it everything. Guard Coulter took one step to the side, creating space between them. His movements were still measured, still dignified, but there was something else there now. A glimmer of warmth. He held his makeshift sword at an angle, a traditional fencing pose. His face remained mostly neutral, but at the corner of his mouth, the tiniest hint of a smile threatened to break through. The palisade stood frozen, torn between stopping this and letting it unfold. She glanced toward the palace windows, wondering if anyone inside was watching. The Prince and Princess of Wales could see their daughter challenging a guard to combat. Her radio crackled at her hip, but she didn't reach for it. Not yet. Charlotte lunged forward with her toy sword, a playful jab toward the guard's knee. Coulter stepped back smoothly, blocking with his cloth sword. The tourists cheered. Children in the crowd jumped with excitement. Parents lifted little ones onto their shoulders for a better view. Back and forth they went. Charlotte attacking with all the energy of a child at play. Coulter defending with the grace of a trained soldier who was somehow impossibly playing along. Each move was controlled, gentle, careful. He never let his cloth sword touch her, always pulling back at the last second. She never actually struck him, though she came close. Her wooden blade whooshing through the air with determination. The scene was surreal. A palace guard in full ceremonial uniform, symbol of unwavering discipline and tradition. Engaged in a pretend sword fight with a princess who barely reached his waist. It shouldn't have worked. It should have been chaos. But somehow, it was beautiful. Then Charlotte did something that changed everything. She stopped mid-swing, lowered her sword, and looked up at the guard with sudden seriousness. Her small voice cut through the noise of the crowd. "You're really good at this. Have you fought in real battles? The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The crowd went quiet again, sensing the shift. This wasn't just play anymore. Asterisk guard, Coulter froze. His cloth sword lowered slightly. For the first time since the encounter began, real emotion flickered across his face. It was subtle, but it was there. A shadow passed through his eyes. A memory he kept locked away, even from himself. The truth was yes. James Coulter had fought in real battles. Before joining the Queen's Guard, he'd served in Afghanistan. To tours. He'd seen things that still woke him in the night. Friends he'd lost. Moments where the line between life and death was thinner than paper. He carried those memories like stones in his chest, heavy and sharp. But he couldn't say any of that. Not here. Not to a 7-year-old princess with a toy sword and hope in her eyes. So he did what soldiers learn to do. He swallowed it down. He nodded once, barely perceptible, and straightened his posture back into perfect military form. Charlotte saw the nod. She understood, in the way children sometimes understand things adults try to hide. Her expression softened. She lowered her wooden sword completely, holding it at her side. Then she did something that made several people in the crowd wipe their eyes. She saluted him. A proper military salute, her small hand crisp at her forehead, her back straight, her face solemn. She held it for 3 full seconds. A mark of respect. A gesture her father had probably taught her, explaining what it meant when soldiers greet each other. They honor sacrifice. Guard Coulter's breath caught in his throat. Protocol demanded he return salutes only to ranking officers and members of the royal family during official ceremonies. But this wasn't official. This was something else entirely. Something that lived in the space between rules and heart. He shifted his rifle to his left hand in one smooth motion. Then he brought his right hand up in a perfect salute. Sharp. Exact. Military precision. But this time, there was no coldness in it. This time, it carried weight, meaning gratitude for a child who somehow understood what most adults never bothered to see. The crowd erupted into applause again, louder this time. Some people were crying openly now, moved by something they couldn't quite name. A moment of connection. A reminder that beneath the uniforms and protocols and centuries of tradition, there were just people. Just humans trying to do their best, Charlotte beamed. She tucked her wooden sword back into her coat pocket and took a step closer to the guard. She had to crane her neck back to see his face. "Thank you for playing with me," she said softly. "I know you're not supposed to move. I won't tell anyone you did." It was innocent. Pure. She genuinely believed she was protecting him, keeping his secret safe. She didn't know that 300 people had just recorded the entire thing. That by evening it would be all over social media. That news outlets would be calling it the most heartwarming moment of the year. Coulter wanted to speak, wanted to thank her, wanted to tell her she'd just given him something he didn't know he needed. But his voice was locked behind the wall of duty. So he simply nodded again, just once, and returned to his position. Feet together, eyes forward. Back to being a statue, Charlotte seemed satisfied with that. She gave him one more small wave, then turned and walked back toward where the palisade was standing. The aide, who had been holding her breath for the past 5 minutes, finally exhaled. She reached for Charlotte's hand, ready to guide her back inside before anyone official showed up asking questions. But before they could leave, a voice called out from behind them. "Charlotte." It was calm, measured, but it carried authority. Everyone turned. Standing at the palace entrance was Prince William, Charlotte's father. His expression was unreadable. He'd been watching. He'd seen everything. The crowd fell completely silent, wondering if the guard was about to face consequences. If the sweet moment was about to turn sour, William walked forward slowly, his shoes clicking against the stone. He stopped beside his daughter, looking down at her. Then he looked up at Guard Coulter, who stood rigid, staring straight ahead, probably imagining his military career flashing before his eyes. The prince studied the guard for a long moment. The silence stretched unbearably. Then William did something unexpected. He smiled. Not a polite royal smile for the cameras. A genuine smile, warm, human. He placed his hand on Charlotte's shoulder and spoke loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I hope you didn't tire out the guard too much," he said to Charlotte, his tone light. "He still has several more hours of duty ahead of him." Charlotte looked worried suddenly. "Did I get him in trouble?" William knelt down to her level, his voice gentle. "No, darling. You reminded him why he does what he does? That's not trouble. That's a gift." He stood back up, gave Guard Coulter one more approving nod, and guided Charlotte toward the palace as they walked away. Charlotte looked back over her shoulder one last time. Guard Coulter remained still, eyes forward, but something about him seemed different now. Lighter somehow. Less like stone and more like flesh. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people talking excitedly, already pulling out their phones to share what they'd witnessed. But a few stayed behind, just watching the guard, wondering about his story, about what battles he'd fought, about what it must feel like to stand there day after day carrying invisible weight inside the palace. Charlotte ran ahead to find her brothers. William watched her go, then paused at a window overlooking the courtyard. He could see Guard Coulter from here, still standing at attention. William had served in the military himself. He understood the cost of duty. He understood what it meant when someone carried. More than just a rifle, he made a mental note to speak with the commanding officer later. Not to reprimand. To commend * by evening, the world knew Charlotte's name for a different reason than usual. Not because of a formal appearance or a royal event, but because of a toy sword and a moment of pure, unscripted humanity. The video had gone viral within 3 hours. Millions of views. Thousands of comments. People from every corner of the globe watched the tiny princess challenge the stoic guard. Watched him choose kindness over protocol. Watched two worlds collide in the most unexpected way. News anchors called it a modern fairy tale. Social media users called it the most British thing ever, and proof that royals are just like us. But the people who'd been there, who'd witnessed it in person, they called it something else. They called it magic. Back at the guard barracks that evening, James Coulter sat on his bunk, still in uniform, staring at his phone. His commanding officer had called him in an hour earlier. Coulter had walked to that office expecting the worst. A written warning, reassignment, maybe even discharge instead. He'd found Colonel Morrison sitting behind his desk with a slight smile on his face. "Sit down, Coulter," the colonel had said. Not angry. Almost amused. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Coulter had swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. I broke protocol. I engaged with a civilian while on duty. I moved from position without authorization, i.e. gave the royal family the best publicity they've had in 5 years," Morrison interrupted. "The press office has been fielding calls all day. Positive calls. People calling to say how moved they were, how it reminded them what the monarchy is supposed to represent." The colonel leaned back in his chair. "The Prince of Wales himself called. He wanted to make sure you weren't being disciplined. Said his daughter has been talking about her friend the guard all afternoon." Coulter's eyes had widened. "Sir, you're not in trouble, son. You're being commended. Sometimes duty means following orders, and sometimes it means knowing when to follow your heart instead." Morrison stood, extending his hand. "Well done." Now, hours later, sitting alone, Coulter still couldn't quite believe it. He scrolled through the comments on the viral video. Thousands of strangers weighing in on those few minutes that had felt like a lifetime. This guard is a hero. The way he played along with her. I'm crying. Imagine being that little girl and having that memory forever. Someone find out who this guard is? He deserves recognition. But one comment stopped him cold. It was from a username he didn't recognize, but the words cut straight through him. "My son served with the Queen's Guard before he took his own life last year. PTSD. No one saw the signs. Thank you to this guard for showing vulnerability, for showing that soldiers are human. I hope he's getting the support he needs." Coulter's hand trembled. He set the phone down and pressed his palms against his eyes. He'd been one of the lucky ones. He'd come home from Afghanistan physically intact. But the invisible wounds were still there. The nightmares. The sudden panic when cars backfired. The guilt of surviving when others hadn't. He'd never talked about it. Not really. Soldiers didn't talk. They endured. They pushed through. They stood at attention and didn't move and pretended the weight of their memories didn't exist. But today, a 7-year-old girl with a wooden sword had cracked something open in him, had reminded him that he wasn't just a uniform, that beneath the red tunic and the bearskin hat, it was James. Just James. A person who'd seen too much and carried too much and maybe, just maybe, needed to let some of it go. There was a knock at his door. Coulter wiped his eyes quickly and stood. "Come in." The door opened. It was Matthews, another guard who'd been on duty nearby during the incident. He held out a small envelope. "This came for you." "Courier delivered it to Morrison. Said it was urgent." Coulter took the envelope, confused. It was heavy paper, expensive, official. His name was written on the front in elegant handwriting. He opened it carefully. Inside was a note card with the royal seal at the top. The message was handwritten, personal, in what was clearly a child's careful script. "Dear Guard Coulter, thank you for the duel. You were very brave. I hope your battles weren't too scary. If you ever want to play again, I will be there. You won, but only because I let you. Your friend, Princess Charlotte. P.S. My papa says you are a good man." Below Charlotte's signature was another line in adult handwriting. "Thank you for your service, both abroad and at home. Your humanity honors the uniform. With gratitude, William." Coulter read it 3 times, then a 4th. His vision blurred. He'd received medals for his military service, commendations, certificates, but none of them had ever meant what this simple note meant. None of them had ever seen him the way this child had seen him. Matthews cleared his throat. "You all right, mate?" Coulter nodded, not trusting his voice. He carefully folded the note and placed it back in the envelope. This was going somewhere safe, somewhere he could find it on the hard days. The days when the memories got too loud and the weight got too heavy, and he finally managed. "I'm all right." That night, Coulter did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He called the Veterans Helpline, the number he'd been given when he left active duty, the one he'd stored in his phone but never used because asking for help felt like weakness. A calm voice answered. "Veterans Crisis Line. You're not alone. How can I help?" Coulter took a shaky breath. "Hi, my name's James. I think I need to talk to someone about some things I've been carrying." "That's incredibly brave, James. I'm here to listen." And for the first time since coming home, Coulter started to talk. Really talk. About the weight. About the memories. About standing at attention for hours trying to become invisible when what he really needed was to be seen. 3 weeks later. Something extraordinary happened at a military veterans center in South London. James Coulter walked through the doors for the first time, his hands shoved in his jacket pockets, his heart hammering with nervousness. This wasn't a place he'd ever imagined himself visiting. Soldiers handled things alone. They didn't need support groups. They didn't need therapy, at least. That's what he'd always told himself. But Charlotte's note sat folded in his wallet, and her question echoed in his mind constantly. "Have you fought in real battles?" She'd asked it with such innocence, such genuine care. And somehow, that simple question had unlocked something. If a 7-year-old could be brave enough to challenge a guard twice her size, maybe he could be brave enough to face his own demons. The center was nothing like he'd expected. No sterile walls or clinical atmosphere. Just a comfortable room with worn couches, a coffee maker gurgling in the corner, and a circle of chairs where 6 other veterans sat talking quietly. They looked up when he entered. No judgment in their eyes. Just recognition. They knew why he was there. They'd all been there themselves, James. An older woman approached him, her smile warm. "I'm Sarah. We spoke on the phone. Welcome. Grab some coffee if you want, and whenever you're ready, join us." Every instinct screamed at him to turn around and leave. But he thought of Charlotte's salute, her small hand at her forehead, honoring him even though she didn't fully understand what she was honoring. He owed it to her, to himself. To be as brave as that little girl had been, Coulter poured a coffee he didn't really want and sat down in the circle. For the first 10 minutes, he just listened. Others shared their stories. A woman who'd served in Iraq, a man who'd lost his leg in an IED explosion, another who simply couldn't sleep anymore without seeing the faces of fallen friends. Each story was different, but the thread connecting them was the same. The weight, the silence, the belief that asking for help meant you'd failed somehow. Then Sarah looked at him gently. "James, would you like to share anything?" No pressure. "Only if you're comfortable." He stared at his coffee cup. The room was quiet, patient, giving him space. And then slowly, he started talking. 3 weeks ago, I was on duty at Buckingham Palace. I'm with the Queen's Guard. And this little girl, this princess, she challenged me to a duel with a toy sword. A few people smiled, recognizing the story. It had been everywhere. But they didn't interrupt. They let him continue. I broke protocol. I engaged with her. I played along. And for those few minutes, I wasn't thinking about Afghanistan, or the things I saw there, or the friends I lost. I was just present, just human. His voice cracked. I hadn't felt that way in 3 years. Not since I came home. The woman who'd served in Iraq nodded knowingly. Sometimes it takes a child to remind us who we were before the war, before we learned to shut everything down. I got a note from her afterward, Coulter continued. She thanked me for playing. She said she hoped my battles weren't too scary. He pulled out the note, now creased from being handled so many times. She's 7 years old. She doesn't understand what PTSD is or what it's like to watch someone die. But somehow she knew I needed kindness. She saw me when I'd spent years trying to be invisible. Sarah leaned forward. What did that feel like? Being seen? Coulter was quiet for a long moment. Terrifying. And necessary. Both at the same time. He looked around the circle. I've spent 3 years telling myself I'm fine. That I don't need help. That asking for support means I'm weak. But I'm not fine. And pretending I am is killing me slowly. The room held space for his confession. No one rushed to fix him or offer empty platitudes. They just sat with him in the truth of it. Coming here today, Coulter said, this is the hardest thing I've done since I left active duty. Harder than standing for 8 hours in the rain. Harder than maintaining composure when tourists try to make you flinch. This is real bravery. Admitting I can't do this alone. The man who'd lost his leg spoke up. That little girl gave you a gift. She showed you that being human isn't weakness. It's strength. We all need that reminder sometimes. Over the following weeks, Coulter kept coming back. Some days were harder than others. Some sessions left him exhausted, drained from reliving memories he'd buried. But slowly something shifted. The nightmares became less frequent. The panic attacks loosened their grip. He started sleeping more than 3 hours a night. He learned that healing wasn't linear. That some days he'd feel strong, and others he'd feel like he was back at square one. But he also learned he didn't have to carry it alone. That the weight was lighter when shared. Meanwhile, Charlotte's impact rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. The video of her duel with the guard had done more than go viral. It had sparked a conversation. About mental health in the military, about the hidden struggles of soldiers who come home, about the importance of seeing the people behind the uniforms. Veterans. Organizations reported a surge in calls to their helplines. Soldiers who'd been suffering in silence reached out, many citing the viral video as their reason for finally seeking help. If that guard can show vulnerability, one veteran wrote in an online forum, then maybe I can too. A military mental health charity launched a campaign called Charlotte's Challenge, encouraging people to reach out to veterans in their lives, to see them as humans first and heroes second. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in. Volunteers signed up. Conversations started happening in families and communities that had never discussed mental health before. Charlotte herself had no idea about any of this. To her, it had just been a game. A fun morning playing pretend with a nice guard? But her parents knew. William and Catherine watched the ripple effects with quiet pride. Realizing their daughter had done something remarkable without even trying, she'd simply been herself. Kind, curious, brave. One afternoon, Catherine sat with Charlotte in the palace gardens. "Do you remember the guard you played with?" she asked gently. Charlotte's face lit up. "The one with the sword made of cloth." "Yes. Is he okay?" "I haven't seen him again," Catherine smiled. "He's doing very well. In fact, he wanted me to give you something." Catherine reached into her pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. It was simple but beautifully crafted, with Charlotte's initials carved into the lid. Charlotte opened it carefully, her small hands gentle with the treasure inside. Nestled in velvet was a miniature sword. Not a toy this time. A real ceremonial piece scaled down to child size, but made with the same craftsmanship as the ones carried by the Queen's Guard. During official ceremonies, the blade gleamed silver, the handle wrapped in crimson and gold thread. Engraved along the blade were words Charlotte had to sound out slowly. "For Princess Charlotte." A warrior's heart beats in the smallest chests. "With deepest respect and gratitude, Guard James Coulter." Charlotte traced the words with her finger, her expression serious. "Mama, did I help him somehow?" Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. Her daughter's intuition was remarkable. "Yes, darling, you did. More than you know, but I just played with him. I didn't do anything special." "Sometimes the most special things are the ones we don't try to do," Catherine explained. "You saw him, not just his uniform or his job. You saw the person, and that mattered to him very much." Charlotte held the sword carefully, understanding that this was more than just a gift. It was a symbol. A connection between two people from completely different worlds, who'd met for just a few minutes, but had changed each other forever. 6 months passed. Winter gave way to spring. James Coulter continued his therapy, continued showing up at the Veterans Center, continued learning how to live with his memories instead of being buried by them. He was promoted to Lance Corporal, his commanding officer citing his exemplary service and his role in humanizing the Guard in the public eye. But the real change was internal. The weight he'd carried for 3 years hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed. It was no longer a crushing burden. It was simply part of his story, part of who he was. And he was learning that was okay. On a warm May morning, Coulter was stationed outside the palace again. Same position, same red tunic, same bearskin hat. Tourists gathered as always, taking photos, hoping for something memorable. And then he saw her. A small figure in a yellow dress, walking beside her mother, heading toward a car that would take them to some official engagement. Charlotte spotted him at the same moment. Her whole face transformed with recognition and joy. She broke away from Catherine's hand and ran toward him. Not with a toy sword this time. Just with the pure happiness of seeing a friend, she stopped directly in front of him, bouncing slightly on her toes. "Hello, Guard Coulter," she said brightly. "I've been practicing my sword fighting. I'm much better now." Couldn't respond. Protocol still demanded his silence, his stillness. But his eyes shifted down to meet hers, just for a second. And in that second, she saw everything. The gratitude. The healing. The life that had been lived in the 6 months since their duel. Charlotte understood. She didn't need words. She simply reached out and gently touched his hand, the one gripping his rifle. Just a brief connection. A reminder. Then she saluted him properly, holding it for 3 full seconds, before dropping her hand and running back to her mother. Catherine smiled at Coulter, nodding her acknowledgement, then guided Charlotte toward the waiting car. As they drove away, Charlotte looked back through the window, watching the guard return to his statue-like stance. But she knew better now. She knew that inside that uniform was a person. A person with a story. A person who'd fought battles both on foreign soil and inside his own mind. A person who was healing. The tourists who'd witnessed the exchange pulled out their phones, of course. By evening, it would be another viral moment. Princess Charlotte and her guard friend reunite. The internet would melt down again with sweetness and emotion. But this time, the comments would be different, more informed, more aware. Because in the 6 months since the original video conversations had been happening, education spreading, understanding growing, people knew now that behind every uniform was a human being, that soldiers carried more than just weapons, that asking for help wasn't weakness, that healing was possible. The Veterans Center in South London had tripled in size, now serving 3 times as many people as it had before. The Charlotte's Challenge campaign had raised millions for military mental health services. Soldiers around the world had started speaking up about their struggles, inspired by a guard who'd let himself be human for just a few minutes in front of a little girl with a toy sword. 1 year later, on the anniversary of their first encounter, Coulter received another envelope. This time it contained a hand-drawn picture. Charlotte had sketched the two of them, stick figures with swords raised, mid-duel. Above the drawing, in her careful child's handwriting, she'd written, "Thank you for teaching me that the bravest warriors are the ones who let people see their hearts." Coulter framed it, hung it in his flat. On the hard days when the memories came back sharp and painful, he would look at that drawing and remember that he'd been seen, that he'd been valued not despite his struggles, but including them, that a child had looked at him and found him worthy of kindness. He kept serving in the Queen's Guard, kept standing at attention outside Buckingham Palace, kept being the statue tourists expected to see. But inside, he was different now. Inside, he was healing. Inside, he carried Charlotte's lesson with him always. Be brave enough to be human. Be strong enough to ask for help. Be open enough to let people see you. Years later, when Charlotte was grown and taking on royal duties of her own, journalists would sometimes ask her about that viral moment. "Do you remember the guard you challenged to a duel?" They'd ask, and she'd smile, her response always the same. "I remember a person who taught me that kindness costs nothing but means everything. He wore a uniform, but what I saw was his courage. Not the courage of battle, but the courage to heal. That's the kind of warrior I hope to be." The wooden sword he'd given her sat in a display case in her private quarters. She never forgot where it came from, never forgot the lesson it represented, that sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest changes, that seeing someone, really seeing them, can save a life. And somewhere in London, James Coulter continued his work. Still a guard, but also a mentor now, helping younger soldiers navigate the challenges of military life and the transition home. He spoke at veterans events. He shared his story. He told them about a little girl who'd challenged him to a duel and in doing so had saved his life. Because that's what she'd done. Not with a sword, not with grand gestures or official interventions, but with simple, fearless humanity, with the willingness to see beyond the uniform to the person inside, with the reminder that we're all fighting battles others can't see. And the bravest thing we can do is let ourselves be seen anyway. The tourists still gather at Buckingham Palace every morning. They still take photos of the guards. They still try to make them smile or flinch or move. But now, when they look at those red tunics and bearskin hats, some of them pause. Some of them remember. Some of them see past the uniform to the person inside and think about Charlotte's lesson. Everyone is fighting their own battles. Everyone deserves to be seen. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to look past the armor and say, "I see you." And that's enough. That's what Charlotte taught the world. That's what her duel really meant. Not a game between a princess and a guard, but a moment of connection that reminded everyone watching that behind every uniform, every title, every role we play, there's just a person trying their best, carrying their weight, deserving of kindness. And if a 7-year-old girl can be brave enough to see that, maybe we all can.